Welcome back. In the last video, we said that we are talking about semantic memory, and there are two types of semantic memory: conceptual and situational knowledge. In the first video, we talked about conceptual knowledge. We also talked about the general structure of the semantic memory and the processing involved in semantic memory, which equally applies to both conceptual knowledge and situational knowledge. In this video, we're going to talk about situational knowledge. Just like we have concepts for objects we experience, we also have concepts for situations. And these concepts are called schemata or scripts. And the basic structure of these concepts is same as the one we discussed in Semantic Memory 1. What is different is the content of these concepts. Schemata is plural, schema is singular, script is singular, and scripts is plural. Schemata and scripts are pretty much the same. A schema is a simpler version, whereas a script is a more complex version of a given situation. What do we mean by situational concepts? Just like we have categories of things as concepts, like we have concepts for apple, we have concept for love, concept for different objects we experience in our life, we also have concepts for situations we experience. For instance, what would you do when you go to a restaurant like Applebee's, for instance? Okay, you go and you wait for the person, and then you take the seat, and yes, you're right, you'll get a menu, and the person will introduce herself or himself, then what you want for drink, then they give the menu. Just imagine you went to McDonald's. What do? You go there, do you wait there? You don't, right? Because you have concepts specific to these situations called restaurants. How did you develop these concepts? You develop these concepts based on your experiences with restaurants when you were little. Based on these experiences, you've extracted what is common to several experiences and put together a concept related to situation. That is schema. A schema is something that you've extracted, a routine, a structure, a pattern out of your experiences related to not objects. Then it will be a concept here specific to situations. So it's a situational concept. We call that schema. A more complex schema is called a script. What is the use of it? Well, when you encounter a similar experience, you go to a different McDonald's, for instance, you use these schemas to guide your behavior. So you know you don't need to wait. You can actually go and stand in line. What schemas do is they guide our behavior. They help us understand a situation so that when you go to movies, you know what to expect. When you go to a wedding, you know what to expect. This generalized knowledge about different situations will guide your behavior, will help you anticipate things. So what makes semantic memory 2 and 1 similar is that these are generalized knowledge common to everyone. That's what semantic memory is, generalized knowledge. If it's about individual objects, you call those concepts. For ideas, it's a concept. If it's about situations, then it's called a schema. It's like a mental rule book of what to do, what not to do, what happens, what to expect. When you read a text, that's what the context is for this class, right? When you read a text, you try to understand what is presented in the text. Now, here's a question. When you read a book like this, Harry Potter series, what knowledge do you use the most? Keep in mind, you use both semantic memory 1 and 2. You need both. Is there one memory that you use more than the other? In other words, do you use one general knowledge more than the other? Specifically, do you use more conceptual knowledge or situational knowledge? What do you think? Pause here for a second and come back. You're absolutely right. We use schema or script more than conceptual knowledge. In other words, we use more of semantic memory too. Why? Well, these stories are about different situations. These are not about concepts or constructs or ideas. These are about situations. That doesn't mean you don't use conceptual knowledge, but you use more of situational knowledge. How about when you read a book like this? What do you use the most? Conceptual knowledge or schema? You're right. We use more of conceptual knowledge. By the way, if you haven't read this book, you should. This is a good book about the history of time. It talks about a lot of things in a simple way so we can form our own concepts about the universe. Although the book describes situations, it's mostly about the constructs related to a cosmos. So you use more of conceptual knowledge. Okay. So what we'll talk about in this video is semantic memory 2. First, we'll talk about the history of schema, and then we'll talk about some specifics of these constructs, namely schema and scripts. So let's talk about the history first. Now, coming to the history of the research on schema, the idea of schema was first proposed by a UK-based researcher named Bartlett. What Bartlett did is he studied memory for meaningful material, especially folk tales. An example of a folk tale that we'll look into on the next slide is the War of the Ghosts. The task for the participants would be to read stories like these, the folk tales, and then participants will recall the story several times immediately after reading the story, after a few days, after a few weeks, after a few months, even years. So the IV is time. Bartlett was interested in to see if there is a change in recall of the stories. In the next slide, we'll look at one of folktale story. Then we'll talk about the results and conclusion. I want you to read this story. If you can't see the entire story, you can download the PDF file specific to this video and read the story. I'm going to read a few messages here just to give you a sense of what this is. This is a folktale story about the war was. One night, two young men from Yuglag, went down to the river to hunt seals. And while they were there, it became foggy and calm. Then they heard war cries, and they thought maybe this is a war party. They escaped to the shore and hid behind a log. Now canoes came up, and they heard the noise of the paddles, and saw one canoe coming up to them. There were 5 men in the canoe, and they said, "What do you think? We wish to take you along. We were going up the river to make war on the people." One of the young men said, "I have no arrows." "Arrows are in the canoe," they said. I will not go along alone. I might be killed. My relatives do not know where I have gone. But you," he said, turning to the other, "may go with them." So one of the young men went, but the other returned home. And the warriors went on up the river to a town on the other side of Kalama. The people came down to the water, and they began to fight, and many were killed. But presently the young man heard one of the warriors say, "Quick, let us go home. The Indian has been hit." Now he thought, "Oh, they are ghosts." He did not feel sick, but they said he had been shot. So the canoes went back to Yugalok, and the young man went shore to his house and made a fire. And he told everybody and said, "Behold, I accompanied the ghosts, and we went to the fight. Many of our fellows were killed, and many of those who had attacked us were killed. They said I was hit, and I did not feel sick." He told it all, and then he became quiet. When the sun rose, he fell down. Something black came out of his mouth. His face became contorted. The people jumped up and cried, "He's dead." Now, when you read a story like this, right, the idea is you're not from this culture. You probably don't understand the background of stories they have in the culture. Just imagine when participants read stories of this kind and recall the story several times. What Bartlett noticed was the recall changed drastically over time. What Bartlett concluded was we don't retain the actual event, but only take the meaningful parts of the stories we read. Now, what does it mean? We'll talk about the meaning of this and how it is related to schemas and scripts in the next slide. What Bartlett found was the recalls changed over time, and he concluded that we don't retain the original story, but we actually remember the meaningful parts of it, and these change over time. What is retained over time in the stories is based on the schemas a reader has, and he called it reconstructive memory. In other words, our schemas influence what we remember about the story we read. So over time, after reading a story, what Bartlett proposed was we construct a memory by combining elements from the original material with our own knowledge based on our own situational concepts, trying to make sense of meaningless information presented to you because you don't have background knowledge of that culture. You try to create your own meaning out of it. He calls it an effort after meaning to make sense of it. Now I'm going to give you an example here. It may sound weird to start with, but I just want you to imagine this. Imagine a hypothetical situation. Invited me to your wedding, and when I came there, you introduced me to your grandmother, and I touched her feet. What do you think you'll make out of this one? How do you make sense of this particular situation? What would be your memory of this particular event of me touching feet of your grandmother? Well, you probably think I'm crazy because you don't have the schema that I have. So you'll develop your own understanding. Maybe in 10 years from now, after your wedding, when somebody asks about your wedding and about me, then you probably say, there was this weird Indian guy. He was trying to pull my grandmother's leg, and luckily we were there. Whatever it is, you try to make sense of the situation to create a meaning based on your own schema. By the way, in Indian culture, when you meet an elder person, you're supposed to touch their feet to show respect and also get their blessings. So, do you understand how schemas influence our memories of the situations that we experience? In Bartlett's research, what is in the recall? Well, what is in participants' recall was reconstructive memory with omissions, missing specific details which doesn't make sense to you based on your schema, and normalization. Successive recalls had some sort of rationalization of the situation. For instance, your rationalization of a story of me touching feet of your grandmother would be trying to rationalize something. He's trying to pull her leg. You try to normalize, rationalize the situation based on your schemas. Bartlett found that the eventual recalls will have a lot of missing specific details and a lot of normalizations. What is incorporated and what is left in our memories? In other words, what is omitted and what is reconstructed is based on schema, the schemas we have, the rule book. So just imagine if you don't have schema for a different culture, you probably have a different understanding of the situations you encounter. It's a scary thing to imagine. What is schema then? A schema is a stored knowledge of situational concepts, a generalized knowledge based on your experiences. How do we comprehend an event then? Well, by putting our experience in the context of a schema. In other words, how do you understand what you read? Well, by putting the experience in the context of the schema. Just imagine you are experiencing a new event. How do you make sense of it? Well, you put that experience in the context of a schema. That's how you experience it. What if you experience a completely novel situation and you don't have a schema for that? How do you think we'll comprehend that experience? Well, it seems like we modify the experience to fit the schema. It's dangerous. If you don't have a schema to make sense of a novel experience, you're modifying the novel experience to fit your schema. But you can ask this question, can't we create new schemas? Yes, you can create new schemas, but it takes repeated exposure to create new schemas. In other words, it takes time. Remember, the schema you have for wedding is created over time. It was not developed through one experience. It took a while. So it takes time to create new schemata. So the bottom line is our schemata will limit our experiences. In other words, you see or experience the schema you learned growing up. So we see what we know already based on our experiences and what we expect or what we want to see. So schemas are very powerful and they produce expectations. Now, this is what I'll do in the next slide. I'll test your general knowledge. I'm going to ask you two quick questions. I want you to answer these questions as quickly as possible. The moment I show you the questions, I want you to answer the question. If you think you answered the question, then give yourself a pat, give yourself points. You ready? I'm going to see you in the next slide with the questions. Okay, I want you to answer these questions as quickly as you can. How many animals of each kind did Moses take onto the ark? And what is the nationality of Thomas Edison, the inventor of telephone? Okay, take a pause, come up with the answers. Yes, you're right. Did you say two for this one? And did you say Germany for this one? Well, this is what most of the students do. But if you carefully read this, the question was how many animals did each of the kind did Moses take onto the ark? It was not Moses. And what is the nationality of Thomas Edison? But Thomas Edison did not invent telephone. Well, this is called Moses illusion. Moses illusion is that people typically make only superficial evaluation of the information given to them. Why? Well, we activate our schemas. The moment you've read the arc, you automatically activated that particular situation, that particular knowledge. So you didn't even pay attention to this information. You filled Moses with Nova, am I right? You didn't read it carefully. That's how schemas guide our behavior. So schemas influence our memory. And the reconstructive memory is the memory that we have for the events that we experience based on our schema, which is different from the actual event itself, the episodic recall. What we already know exerts a strong influence on what we might remember about this new material later on. In other words, what you already know, what you've already experienced, will influence how you experience a new event or what you'll remember about the new event. Now, let's talk about script. Now that we have general idea about schemata, which are the basis of situational knowledge, which are situational concepts. Let's talk about scripts. Okay, what are scripts then? We know what schemata are situational concepts that guide our behavior. These are the ones that we have developed over time by extracting what is common across different situations. A script is nothing but a schema, but it's a complex schema. If a schema is about one simple situation, let's say restaurant, a script is a more complex schema. It has not just one event of restaurant, but several events, and these events are sequences in a chronological order. If you took a class in theater, or if you know acting, there's a script of what happens: the restaurant situation, the park situation, the bedroom situation. So a script is a more complex schema with several different situations, and these situations are all ordered in sequence. Each script, for example, wedding is a script, right? Wedding is a complex event, so it probably has a script with several ordered sequence of events that are incorporated in it. So it's still schemata, but it is more complex. So it has many sub events related to that. We have different versions of a script. So you have a general wedding script, but you have different versions, variants, or tracks of a script. For instance, if it's an Indian wedding, you have a version of it. If you have, say, I don't know what else you have, American wedding, it's a different kind. If it's like Australian wedding, maybe it's a different kind. The basic script you have about the wedding is called a frame. This is your basic frame for a complex event wedding. And this frame defines a basic structure of the script. The default values are the values that are filled by the most commonly experienced script, which is your regular wedding, maybe American wedding. So the default values fill frames unless other information is provided. So in other words, if you hear or read about wedding, the moment you read about it, the default values are put in. If you know specifically about the wedding you're talking about, oh, this Indian wedding, then the specific version of the script kicks in. The bottom line is scripts are more complex schemata, and a frame is a basic script for a given situation. Now, how do we represent scripts and schema? The schemas and scripts are represented as concepts are related to situation. And how do we activate information from scripts and schemas? Well, just as we do with the spread of activation that we discussed related to semantic memory 1. Scripts and schemata are retrieved by spread of activation. It's the same process. So whatever we have learned about the structure of semantic memory and the process of accessing information in semantic memory equally applies to semantic memory too, related to schemata or script. Well, this brings us to the end of the last piece of the puzzle. It's how we comprehend a written text. I hope you enjoyed this. Stay tuned and have fun learning.